Annette Jackson is the Director of Take Two and Tune In Youth Counselling Service. She's also an adjunct associate professor at La Trobe University. She has extensive experience as a practitioner, supervisor, project manager, trainer and senior manager in child protection. And she previously worked as the Regional Child Protection Manager in the Northern Metropolitan Region. She has experience in support services and residential care for children and families at risk. We were hoping to have Joe Tucci here this morning. He's unwell, but luckily for us, we have Gregory Nicolau, CEO and lead consultant psychologist of the Australian Childhood Trauma Group. The Australian Childhood Trauma Group specialises in childhood trauma and attachment, providing support services to individuals, government agencies, non-government agencies and schools, including secondary consultation, training, program review, assessment, referral and research. And I'll cut short those biographies. There's so much more that these people have done. But let's start straight away. I just would like to start by asking you, Gregory, to tell us a bit about the sort of children that you are dealing with. We've heard from Louise and Judy about the sort of direct work they have done with children. Can you tell us a bit about yours?
Most of our work, and I like what Judy was saying, about children need to tell what we want me to be microphoned. Most of the work we do is with children who want to tell their stories, but they don't tell stories in the way that perhaps your own children will tell their stories. They tell their stories by saying, fuck you, or they tell their stories by saying, I don't want to talk to you, because of their experience with adults. But nevertheless, they are telling their stories, and it's my belief that what we have to learn is to become behaviour interpreters. Or just like we have language interpreters, we have behaviour interpreters, and not get so overwhelmed by the way they tell their stories. So that's a lot of our work in looking at listening to children's stories.
Thank you. Well, not as poetically as Gregory put it. I think a lot of the children that we work with in Take Two within Victoria, for those that don't know, we are a program that is funded to work with child protection clients, the majority of whom are in some form of care. And they are indeed children who, ostensibly, when we were set up, it was for children who were showing these difficulties through emotional or behavioural disturbance, or who were at risk of showing those difficulties through their behaviour. Needless to say, we get very few referrals for children who are not already showing those concerns with their behaviour. And in that, I include the babies who the foster parent may describe as, oh no, she's great, she just sleeps all day. And you think, no, that's not great. So it's really paying attention to both those external behaviours that we are probably more attuned to, but equally paying attention to those behaviours or indications of the internal turmoil that we may require more support and training for foster parents, for teachers, for parents, to help them to actually recognise those signs as well.
Thank you, Annette. Now, do we have questions from the floor? Yes, if you can just wait and we'll bring a microphone over so we can all hear. And if you'd like to specifically address your question to one of the panellists, please do.
Thanks very much. Hello, my name's Susan Bowden, and with my colleague Alison Wicks from the University of Canberra, I'm a landscape architect and Alison's an occupational therapist. We're going to be working on doing some design work for this physical space. We've spoken a lot and heard a lot about humans as agents of distress and also agents of healing, but I'd like your comments about place, design and space and nature as agents of healing in this process.
Could I just give a comment on that? Because about 5 years ago, this very issue came up with me. I went to a residential house and I was disgusted at the environment itself, and I was wondering why in the healing process we thought of the mind and we kind of thought of the body, but we never thought of place, environment. So we've had a research project with the School of Architecture and Interior Design called Beyond Building, looking at that very thing. How does space itself add to the healing of children, young people, or even adults for that matter, in schools? It's absolutely critically important. You mentioned again, Judy, something about energy, I think, on one of your slides. energy comes off everything. There's energy in the space because of you as people, but there's energy because of the sort of chairs, the colour in the room, the lights and so forth. And we can actually change space to ensure children feel more safe and secure at different times. We can use light at night time when we put all our lights on in our houses and everybody goes like this instead of closes down. With children who find it difficult to sleep, we can use light to change the atmosphere in the home so that people begin to feel safer in order to decompress. So it's incredibly important, the environment and space.
I was going to say that, in fact, again, in reference to one of Judy's slides about understanding the whole brain and from the brainstem up to the cortex, that understanding the context of space and place as it relates to the way we take in information from our environment. So we understand that we differ in taste and that we differ in music. I remember trying to convince my dad that Bay City Rollers was better than Perry Como. Needless to say, I think he was right now. But we don't necessarily appreciate that people will also respond to a difference in tactile sensation, or a difference in smell, or a difference in the way their proprioception, their physical body, will actually take in information. And if we can help children feel comfortable in their own skin, and we can use the environment, both things like sensory gardens and lighting and fabric, as well as direct, perhaps more mainstream therapeutic input. If we think of that in a holistic way, then we are increasing our chances of helping the children feel calm when we need them to feel calm, and helping them to become more alert when we need them to take in new content and new information.
Judy, you had at the top of one of your lists there, a safe, culturally sensitive place is what children really need. So in terms of the Melaleuca Place garden, which is just waiting to be developed, what are some practical things that the people who are going to be doing this work should be thinking about?
Lots of plants that they can play with their hands. I had a grandson who just in the first years of his development would sit beside different plants and just play with the leaves and smell them. And children do that all the time. And I just want to go on to the place thing because it is such an important thing. I actually don't work inside, and I get called into a community where there's been 21 arrests of child sexual assault. The little girl that suicided into that community in Timor-Leste, in PNG. And I ask people to take me where they need to go, where we're going to do the work. So if I'm doing extensive work, and in one community, they gave us, when we first went in there, this room in the building, the administration building, and you had to unlock and lock the door when you went in and out. And I said to them, are you comfortable in here? Do you feel safe in here? And they went, the people who were there just said, no. And I said, well, where would you like to go? We went down into the middle of the community, and for the 18 months that I was working there, we sat under the mango trees. And we sat separately with the men, with the women and the children doing work. But everybody in the community knew what we were doing, and we sat on the ground under the mango trees. And what's so good about that, and going back to Melaleuca Place, if you've got lots of things, you think you've got to have all these things inside for children to do things with and make story maps with? Well, if I say to a child, can you make me a story? Come on, we'll go for a walk down here, and they will pick things up. And they'll make you a story, you know what sand play is, but they'll make you a story out of the flowers, the seeds, the rocks that they find as they're in that place. Place is such an important thing. And for Aboriginal people, they will tell you, you walk onto a site that's been a massacre site, they immediately can feel the energy. And it's not a safe place.
One of the great things I've learned about the model of Melaleuca Place is that the clinicians will also be able to, they will be going out into the community to places where children feel safe, where they feel comfortable, not necessarily just at this beautiful building that we've all seen today. And I'm wondering, Professor Newman, if you would like to expand on that idea of creating a safe, a comfortable space where the child feels safe.
Yeah, look, I think that's absolutely fundamental, that the way we need to operate is from the child's perspective. And children, even the very young, I think we frequently underestimate their capacity to have a discussion around those sorts of issues. So the language that we use is really important. So talking to children about concepts of safety and trust. They know exactly. And with children who are pre-linguistic, so the very young who I would work with, I think we do very similar things but in non-verbal ways. So we create a place and a way of interacting with the babies that's very much around the baby being able to communicate and have the experience that someone's thinking about them and listening to them.
Can you give us a practical example of that, Louise?
Look, very, very simple. A baby might, let's say so a traumatised baby might be quite wary of looking. I would literally sit with that baby, be respectful of the distance. I think that's important for any traumatised child at any age. But be there, and I would use my tone of voice and non-verbals, and I would literally say to that baby, I know that you're scared and I'm going to just sit here quietly with you and we can just sit together. And give the baby time. And small babies, they will, if they're able to engage in that way, they will then at some point wake up. They might give you a furtive glance, and then I would say to them, I saw you looking at me. So it's a way of connecting with children who essentially have had an assault on the safety of being with someone.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I feel like a roadie at a concert or something. I just want to add to that because there was a guy called, Adam Phillips, who's a British psychoanalyst, and he wrote a beautiful paper called The Magical Art of a Desperate Person. And one of the things he said, he was talking about tantrums that children have, and he was talking about kind of mainstream environments, but I think we can use it to think about kids who experience trauma. He said one of the reasons that when a child throws a Freudian slip. The reasons that when a child throws a tantrum and we send them off to their bedroom, or we threaten them with going to bed early, or we take away the Nintendo, we do something, we deprive them of something, is because we as the adult cannot bear their pain and distress. And I think that happens in the work that we do, that very often these children are letting us know, I don't have the capacity or the skills to be able to manage the stress I'm experiencing, but I do have the ability to let you know out there. The difficulty is that very often with carers and teachers and even workers, when we see this level of distress, that can be frightening for us as adults, but very often we want to close it down rather than to be in the presence of it. And Louise is a nice example of that child who is trying to make contact but saying, I don't want to be attached, it's too painful. She was able to sit with the pain of the child, and over time that child will come to the adult. And I see this again and again in my practice and other clinicians' practice, that when they're able to sit with the pain of the child will come towards you, ultimately. But we have to learn to do that as adults, and as a country we have to learn to sit with the pain of Indigenous people and beyond.
And so much of that is about listening and hearing. Another question from the floor? Yes, down here. I'll come back to you.
Thank you. My name is Fiona and this is for Louise. I am a special ed teacher. I've worked in Indigenous communities. I'm currently a foster carer for 4 children from an extraordinarily traumatic background. We have had these children for 7 years. They have been with us, and between them we've probably been in 6 different homes before they came to us. We are now reaching adolescence. We do not have a diagnosis per se for them, global developmental delay. Our dilemma is we understand about trauma. Trauma doesn't get them support. We don't know how to work with the system to ensure they will be get into adulthood.
Yes, no, I think you raise really significant issue that the system up to date, and hopefully we're talking now about systemic change around this issue, but the system to date has very much focused on additional supports being tied to a diagnostic category. So we've had this whole process of squeezing children into diagnostic categories, sometimes with a very practical and quite understandable motivation that we want the additional support. So I remember when one of the first jobs I did as a child psychiatrist was to be presented by an education department, whole list of children's names, descriptions of their behaviour, and I had to write down, I believe this child, who I never saw, I believe this child has a conduct disorder or an oppositional defiant disorder and needs extra help. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. And I think what you're saying very, very clearly is that the trauma framework and concept hasn't been integrated. So we've had this sort of parallel universe where all of us out there and doing the work understand the reality of child trauma and know that we're dealing with the aftermath and long-term consequences of trauma, but that's not supported. And that's why I made the point about the DSM-5 not working particularly well around these issues, the failure to get developmental trauma as a recognised condition. So I think we still need to advocate for that. I'm personally, whilst I understand the terrible dilemmas of not getting support for children, I'm personally not in favour of squeezing children into diagnoses that don't understand the condition, but sometimes we have no choice. And many of the parents I speak to and carers are obviously in that situation. But the issue is it doesn't help the child. If we can't name the trauma, talk about the trauma and understand trauma, we'll just keep repeating that sort of error. So hopefully somewhere like this develops and contributes in a major way to that debate about what do we call the impact of trauma on children and how do we get it recognised.
Can I just say something? First of all, I think I'm right in saying I couldn't quite hear you that you're working with Indigenous children. You're a foster carer for
These children aren't Indigenous, but we have worked in Indigenous communities before.
They're not. Okay. First of all, I want to recognise your pain. I could feel your distress. The second thing is that I don't know who else in this room has spent most of their life standing up and saying to governments and to service providers, get real, come on. Most of the people kids we're working with, mums we're working with, dads we're working with in the prisons, we're working with trauma stories. And the longer and the more intense we get and the more focus we get on saying that, hopefully other governments are going to take notice, because the greatest investment we can make in Australia is to start to do the healing that needs to be done across all those generations, including your children. I just wanted to recognise your pain, the distress you must be feeling. Thanks.
Annette and Gregory, would you like to comment as well on this?
I think, as you've portrayed very clearly, one of the things that we always need to be conscious of is there's nothing more crucial than that relationship for the child that's within the home, the relationship that can provide the skin-to-skin contact, whether it's an infant, whether it's an adolescent, and just the intimacy of that day-to-day, minute-by-minute relationship that's so key in healing and holding the children. But we also need to have better ways of holding those who are doing the holding. And we need to be thinking about whether it's being a squeaky wheel, whether it's going together with others and being able to advocate, whether it's finding an advocate within the system, but to just keep on doing that, because there is nothing more crucial for these children than these relationships, than the relationships that you and others hold.
I think there are 2 points I have. I've always been interested in why it is. Actually, I'll say this a different way. I don't know if anybody knows what happened in 1854, but it was the Crimea War, and somebody became very famous during that time, Florence Nightingale. She became the mother of nursing. If you compare nursing in 1854 to nursing in 2014, you'd go, there's no comparison. The nurses today are highly skilled, highly talented in the work, and probably most of you wouldn't have an issue of putting your own child into a hospital here in Australia and ensure they were being looked after. The out-of-home care sector, however, in Australia, I think is about 1910. Some parts of it maybe 1880. Melaleuca House, I think you're moving towards where you need to be. But I did a little calculation, Paul, and this is absolutely not trying to make a negative comment, but Melaleuca House has about 4 or 5 people who will be doing some of the healing work. I heard the minister or somebody say earlier there are 600 children in Canberra in out-of-home care. I calculated you'll need probably around about 70 workers to do the healing work for this group of people, direct workers that are doing direct care of these 600 people. Why is it that in Australia we don't actually treat children who've experienced trauma or give them the services that we give to children in hospital? We spent $2 billion building the Royal Children's Hospital in Victoria. $2 billion, and we had lots of telethons for children in hospitals. You get cute little kids with big beers and their families standing around. Now, that's fantastic. How many telethons have we had for children who've been abused? How many? And part of the reason, I actually don't think it's the government's fault, Judy. I think it's my fault and it's your fault and it's the grocer's fault, because we as a community do not stand up, because I think it's what Adam Phillips said. We can't bear the pain, it's just too hard. I think we become traumatised ourselves, in some ways vicariously traumatised. It's too hard. So people like you, we don't want to know that you've got 4 kids in foster care. Your neighbours probably, well, you might have good neighbours, probably don't want to know, but the neighbours of the neighbours probably don't want to know. And in some sense, for you to be able to do the healing work, you'll need a village to do it. You won't be able to do it on your own. And it won't just be counsellors and therapists. You'll need other people in the community to say, we'll stand by you. We'll come and cook meals so you can attend to the healing of the children. We'll come and help you put them to sleep. We'll come and play with them. We'll come and be with you when you're distressed and when they need support. That's the only way it's going to work. I'm absolutely certain about it, that you will have to take greater responsibility, so governments will say, the community is saying this is what they want. And then governments will act, I think.
We do pay a lot of lip service to the idea that it takes a village to raise a child, but we don't always put that into action. We feel it, but we don't always do it. And I'm not known for my mathematical ability, but the same thing, Gregory, when I was hearing about what a great service this was and the care and the intensive support it's going to provide to children, and then you realise that there are about 400 children in out-of-home care in the ACT under the age of 12, and only about 30 or so of them per year will have access to this service, when at the same time we know that every child who is in out-of-home care is there because they have suffered some sort of trauma. And while it's fantastic that what's happening today is happening, there's just so much more to be done. Richard, you had a question or a comment that you would like to put to the panel. We'll just bring the microphone up to you.
When did this monstrous abuse of children begin to exist? Say 50 years ago. And man's knowledge has increased with the education in terms of brain surgery, heart transplants, travel to space, and the technology that man has produced. Why can't he solve his own problems? And what are the statistics 50 years ago? Say, I don't remember much of that happening in the early 60s or late 50s when I was a teenager. Answer me some of those questions, and it's increased so much now. Today, what are the statistics for then and now?
Thanks, Richard. Judy?
Uncle, I need to answer that question. I think it's an important question. I'm 70, and the kind of violence that I'm seeing in our communities, and I'm talking specifically about Aboriginal communities, was not there when I was a child. In fact, I can chart for you the level of domestic violence that started, and then the sexual assaults that are endemic across our communities now. So when the Bringing Them Home report was finished, the Australian New Zealand Association for Psychiatry rang me and said, we're putting in a response to this. So we talked for a long time on the phone as they developed what they were going to do. And at the end of it, this fella says to me, you know, Judy, I don't understand why any group of people would want to put children into institutions. And I laughed and said, well, come on. The people who come out to this country from England, that's how they bring up their kids. They put them into exclusive English public boarding schools and they bastardise them and brutalise them, and then they become the leaders of the country. And there was a dead silence on the other end of the phone, and he said, how would you know that? And now I'm going to do a personal thing. I said, because my husband was one of those kids. He was put into a boarding school when he was 5. He was raped by the time he was 5.5. He got out of that place by the time he was 17, walked away from his country and came to this country. Never ever spoke of it until he had a breakdown after he'd come out of PNG pulling people out of plane crashes after the plane, bodies. And it triggered all his childhood memories. So the trauma came back to him. Now, I can show you, I can walk through with you in Queensland, every single Aboriginal reserve, the detainment centres where our people were placed. And I can show you when, in history, the perpetrator moved in. a school teacher, and I can give you the evidence of that in courts of law. The clergyman, the mechanic who imported Boo movies if the kids did what he wanted them to do for the grog, and in each community, Kawanyama, Mornington Island, Palm Island, every single one of them, you can actually map what we're talking about today. It's come because we've got higher internet access. I can remember when Brax was put into our communities and suddenly people were using Brax to copy the pornography that was coming in. One community in Queensland, in 1988, the mechanic was importing, a community of 950 people, was importing $5,000 of Blue movies from Canberra a week. Now, you transfer that to kids who are 14, 15 years of age coming into adolescence, who haven't got a job and are watching this stuff for 10 hours a day. I mean, this is all documented, and yet we're not taking it seriously. And since that time, from the middle 1980s when I saw this stuff, I have stood up, and there's people in this room who know me from that time. I was kind of jumping up and down then saying this stuff. I'm sorry, I mean, I'm really, that's an important question. But what I learned in this is my husband died last year of all those diseases I put up on that thing there. And as he was coming to his deathbed, he said, "Why is it me?" And I said, "Mike, I teach it every day I go out there. Childhood trauma, including abuse and neglect, is our single most public health challenge. Cancer, stroke, heart disease, all this stuff. You got it all, mate." And he said to me, "Go out and keep teaching it. It's important that other people hear it." So, let me tell you, the POMs brought their dysfunction with them on the prison hulks. We are only now starting to talk about trauma in any way that we can name it. The First World War, the Second World War, we have never named that a man who went to the First World War, whose father went to the First World War, has at least 60% likelihood of having PTSD. And then if his son went to Vietnam, 100% likelihood of having PTSD. We're still dealing with the fellows who come back from Afghanistan. But Henry Reynolds' book that says the forgotten wars in Australia also tells us what we should be looking at in this country. Because in war zones, the UN has only just now said that sexual violence in wars, during conflict in war, is a crime. For Christ's sake, we're human beings.
Judy, if I could jump in there too and just extend that in a question to Louise about the Royal Commission into child abuse at the moment and the horrific stories we're hearing about people's experiences and also the cover-ups that we're hearing about too. Do you think that this process will affect real change in the fact that people will be more willing to listen and more willing to speak up when they suspect something is happening?
Well, look, I certainly hope so. I think what we're noticing with the Commission, which just relates to the original question, is how many older people are coming forward and talking about events that might have been 60 years ago. And they're giving very moving accounts of the developmental implications of that, the way that that's had such long-term and often devastating consequences on them. Look, it's going to be a major issue for government, I guess, to decide or have hopefully some sensible thinking about what on earth are we going to do, the response to this. And now, I mean, we're looking at so many different. There's institutions, there's systemic cover-up, obviously, that's been very effective, but the floodgates are open. So everyone from the swimming coaches to whoever, people are feeling at least they've got a place to tell their story. That's hugely significant. I'm not sure what the response will be. We're certainly not prepared for the amount of support and intervention and help that people will need. I'm personally going with a fellow that I met many years ago who's a 69-year-old man who wants to talk about his experiences as a blind infant who was institutionalised and grossly abused for many, many years. And he's got health problems, and the most important thing he said to me is that this is what I'm doing before I die, and the most important thing that I can do, I think, is just to go with him. But we've got many people who are going by themselves and are making incredible disclosures, and I think everyone's feeling a bit paralysed about what to do with it.
Sorry, there is a piece of work we're doing in support of the Royal Commission because we got some there was some funding put out some time ago, and what we do know, over 70% of the people presenting at the Royal Commission are over at the age of 30, and over 50% are over the age of 50. So, Uncle Richard, I actually think what we're discovering 50 years ago it was happening, but people weren't talking about it. So I do think today, which is a good thing, we're hearing more of the stories. But I do think still as a community, because the issue with Rolf Harris as an example, that's been in the media, of course, what we've noticed with Rolf Harris, everyone's burning his paintings and putting painting over his face and everything because we're trying to eradicate him from existence. I actually don't think that's a helpful way to go, because what we do is we try and take him out of our consciousness and say we don't want to even think about why it was Rolf Harris did this. We don't even think about him as a person. Now, I grew up loving Rolf Harris as a kid and the old, whatever the thing he was doing with that board. I don't want to eradicate those good experiences I had of Rolf Harris and me as my childhood. What I want to understand is how it is Rolf Harris and the community allowed somebody like Rolf Harris to do what he did. And we can't do it unless we allow our minds to stay and bear the pain of people like Rolf Harris. We won't fix it by eradicating what's gone on.
I think the other thing I would say is I think statistics are a little bit like diagnoses. They can be very helpful and they can be very misleading. And we have a society that only puts value on things we can count, and that's a problem. And what we do need to do is be able to count other things. And how do you count hope? How do you count self-esteem? How do you count cultural connection and place and all these other things which we've talked about today as being very important? So I think it's the storytelling that we have to do as well as the counting. I think counting is important. It has a role. We didn't count stats the same way 50 years ago that we do now, so we can't make those kind of comparisons. But one of the things that the statistics are telling us now, and again it feeds on what Judy was saying, is that the pattern is getting worse. And if we look at what's happening with drugs and alcohol in our society today in Australia, let alone the counts around child maltreatment and incarceration in prisons, if we do not do something as a society, as a village, as an individual, we will not be able to afford the problems we are going to be creating for ourselves and for our children.
Thank you. We have time for one more question before the break for lunch. Who would like to ask that question? Yes, if we could have... okay. We'll just get the microphone to you. Thank you.
I think we've had a wonderful talk, particularly from our distinguished colleague here and from all of our speakers, but I'm sad that the word gender has not come up at all. The trauma history that came from the UK was gendered for men, because that's what did happen in those private schools. But the gender issue is still washed under the table in this country currently, and I think that's a major issue. I've been at a meeting with distinguished people. I was the only woman on this committee, and these very distinguished senior men spoke about how so-and-so's career shouldn't have been upset because he had oral sex with his daughter. His career was more important than what this did to the child. And if we can have distinguished people in high positions... I mean, I went into a state of shock and then I said, that's rubbish. Of course it could hurt. But the fact is that these people were laughing and thought there was no problem. If that can happen in this society, and it's probably about the time that Judy mentioned, this is this gender issue is something that we have to talk about. And I think you spoke so warmly about looking after your children. And looking after our children is a central issue that all of our speakers have brought up. But when I do work on the CAM service, it's not only the refugee children who are suffering, it's children in our own well-to-do community, in the ACT, highly educated. How on earth is this still happening now when we know it's such an enormous problem, such terrible impact on health and wellbeing and on the child's future?
Let's
we
put
know
that
people
to...
have courage and they get through it, and often hang on to it and make a life. But we shouldn't have to deal with that.
Let's put that to the panel. Who would like to start the response? Gregory, you've got the microphone.
I'm a bloke. Do I start the response? I think a couple of things. I was fortunate enough to have 4 sisters and no brothers, and I'm the baby, so there was something really helpful in my understanding of kind of being in the world. Jokes aside, I actually think we should force quotas in Parliament. There should be a 50-50 split between men and women. In fact, maybe in every sector where there's an MP, it should be one male, one female MP, and they all have to get together and kind of work it out. I know that sounds it's never going to happen, but I think there is something about this idea in society that I don't know how to change it, that men are put in places in Parliament and Prime Ministers. We've only had one woman Prime Minister and she was vilified and destroyed as a person. I think it was absolutely disgusting. I don't know how to change it. Me as one person, I don't know. I think gender is important. I wish we saw, but there's also another part to it. In primary school, why is it we don't see more men in primary schools acting as good role models within a primary school? So it does in different institutions around Australia, or probably around the world. We see reverse examples of that also, that there are places where men should be, where they're not. But there are absolutely some places where there are too many men. Absolutely.
Annette?
I'm going back to the first question about place, and I always think we need more women architects whenever I go to the theatre, because there just aren't enough toilets for the women. I think whether we're talking about the child and it's a little boy or a little girl, whether we're talking about mothering and fathering, and we know how often we miss the father, whether they're present or absent, their impact, whether it's a risk factor or a protective factor, the role of the grandmother, the grandfather, the uncle, the aunties, the sisters, the brothers. We have to be thinking about siblings for these children. They are often the most long-lasting relationship any of us will ever have is with a brother or sister. And yet we don't privilege these key relationships. I was on a plane recently, like Judy, we were on separate planes, but 35 hours on around the world, and I met a young man who we got into a conversation for some reason about mental health and babies, and he said, and I believe, what's really important is that we educate children as early as possible and we stop using baby talk. And I thought, wrong and wrong. I said, well, actually, baby talk or motherese, is known in so many different cultures as being a key sequential step in language development and in that attunement, that parenting-infant relationship. And how do we privilege that mother-infant speak, or whether it is somebody else who's doing it? And I said, and if you just change the word educate to play, I'm with you. And we just talked. The steward had to come and tell us to shut up. We were keeping other passengers away. But I do think we have to have these conversations in every place we can. Hopefully by invitation, or we get a bad reputation. But we do need to be brave and actually say the uncomfortable things that are hard for people, and that includes the way we talk about, the way women talk about women, the way women talk about men, the way men talk about women, the way men talk about men.
Judy and Louise, I'll have to ask you to keep it brief.
This will be... thank you, Beverly. I think that gender is a critical issue here. And again, I'm talking from what I know within Aboriginal Australia. What I am seeing at the moment is that we're focusing on young men who are moving into JJ, adult prison. We're just accepting that our young girls are going to have babies. And I would say that it's not just gender, it's race. Race and gender go together. There is still a high level of racism out there. So what I have seen in the last number of time that I'm working on the ground is an attitude about our young girls. Oh, look, she's down there with the truckie. She's just doing this and that. And okay, so she's going to have a baby by the time she's 14 or 15, and she'll have another one and another one and another one. So just two things that I think that about gender that we've really got to get on top of is I sat with a young woman from Palm Island, 28 years of age. She had 8 babies. Nobody ever asked where the fellas were. It was just that she'd had 8 babies. 6 of them had been removed from her. And she just had a newborn baby, and I was sitting with her with a 2-year-old. And I was stunned at the kind of language, the really sexualised swearing language she was using on this little 2-year-old all the time that we were in that room together. I felt sick. And yet I could see that she had never had any other socialisation. I'm talking about a young girl that was brought into my office when I was in the university, and, hey, sorry, I'm not in Southern Cross now, I've retired. And she was brought in for me to witness that she was with a young boy who had had a court-mandated thing to say that he was not to associate with her. She was 7 months pregnant, she was 14 years of age, and his grandparents. The grandfather was a known sexual offender. I had to witness that so I could make a statement to the authorities about this, what was happening. She is now 19 years of age, and she has had 4 children who've all been removed from her. And she is an out-and-out alcoholic. She was the most beautiful young child I had seen when she was 14 at 7 months pregnant. Her face is totally disfigured now, and she is just into alcohol and other drug misuse. Gender is the most critical issue, along with race, because there is this concept that will focus on the young fellas, the young boys, but hey, these girls are just going to have babies. And you know, quite often they don't have a choice in this. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. Okay.
Louise, would you like to say anything?
I got a grumpy pill today, I think.
That's good grumpiness.
I mean, obviously gender's crucial. I work pretty much exclusively with young women who've been traumatised, and in a preventive way. But I think the issue, to broaden it, is about values. I think the challenge is how can we promote values which are more typically associated with the feminine, which is not necessarily represented in politics or structures. That's a big issue, and I agree with that. But the values are about promoting healthy connectedness, promoting relationships, valuing as a society parenting as a function, valuing the contribution of the very young and children to all of us. So somewhere in this we have to focus on gender, but we also have to focus on the infant in that discussion.
Thank you so much. And I could listen to you all day, but I know that lunch beckons and you've got a really full list of activities for this afternoon as well. So I'd just like you to put your hands together to thank our panellists, Louise Newman, Judy Atkinson, Annette Jackson and Gregory Nicolau. Thank you so much. And thank you for such excellent questions.